Okay, so now on to the case study for today. With many councils having net zero targets to work towards, we have asked Darren O'Connell from Shoalhaven City Council to share his case study on their work in this space. Darren O'Connell currently works for Shoalhaven City Council as the Energy Management Coordinator. He has prepared Council's first sustainable energy policy and strategy. Darren has also project managed 600 kilowatt of solar PV installation on 14 council assets, implemented council's revolving energy fund, and initiated LED lighting upgrades for buildings and residential street lighting across the Shoalhaven LGA. Darren has completed a master's in environmental management and worked for almost 15 years in environmental sustainability and energy management for the state and local government sectors. His ambition is to become a net zero superhero. So I'm going to hand over to you, Darren, and I'll stop sharing my screen. It's all yours now, Darren.
Thank you, Sarah. Yep, I'll just get on the right screen. Just give me half a sec. Okay, we should be good. Sorry, Sarah, just check you're seeing just the full screen, not my notes.
I can't see your screen yet. Sorry, Darren.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I've got to. Oh, sorry, I forgot to hit the share. All good?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, just as long as you're seeing the actual full screen there.
Yeah, it's in presentation mode, so that's perfect.
Okay, let me just jump. Okay, good to go. Thank you, everybody, and for your attendance. And I really do hope you've got at least one more webinar in you today, because I know it's been a long few years for many of us to keep, turning up at the screen. So at least we're really branching out today with lots and lots of council staff. So I think this was an exclusive webinar for council staff. So that's really good, because you're a snapshot of what I do. And today I was wanting to share Shoalhaven's journey with regard to sustainable energy, share some tips and tricks, and talk about some of the issues that we've had along the way as well. I know you'd think that we timed this absolutely perfect, this net zero talk, to coincide with COP26 and the federal government's net zero emissions target and plan, but that was all just pure luck. So I'll be honest with that. We picked this date many months ago. I hadn't really thought that far in advance of what was coming up. New COP26 was later in the year, but how about that? We've slap bang in the middle of it, and just after the government's the announcements on net zero. So what a great time to talk about it. Just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we all gather today. I'm actually working from home in Kiama today, which is actually to acknowledge also the Dharawal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. The name Kiama actually comes from the Dharawal word Kairama, which is interpreted as where the sea makes a noise. If any of you have ever been to Kiama, you'll probably know that we're well known for our blowhole, which typically attracts about 1 million people a year to visit. And I expect probably 1 million people on Saturday after lockdown ends. So we'll see you in Kiama on Saturday. As I said, there's lots going on with net zero in the media a lot, has been in a lot for most of the year, off and on. A lot of talk around it, which sort of can be a bit challenging to me, because a lot of the talk is on the setting of the goals and the targets. And time continues to pass when we should be doing something about it. So for me, that can be a little frustrating. But basically, a week or two ago, the federal government was almost forced into setting or accepting as a net zero emissions by 2050, probably to do with the COP26 taking place. Interestingly enough, I think even though there may be some lack of leadership at the federal level with regard to climate change, there's still been a lot going on, and a lot of residents, a lot of businesses, and a lot of local governments have really made quite a lot of action, moved with a lot of action on climate change and moving forward with solutions. So it's interesting, isn't it? We sort of sometimes look at our leaders to guide us, but in some cases the issue takes over itself, and it just sometimes makes good sense to move, which a lot of us are doing. Australia's emissions reduction plan, launched last week, is interesting because around 70% of the solutions in that plan rely on technology. And some of it is technology that doesn't even exist yet and is unnamed. So I guess what we can do is look more at the local council level on what we can do for technology that does exist, and move forward with that. The interesting, the people, the National Party came to this with a whole bunch of conditions, such as not buying into methane, etc. And we're going to talk a little bit about methane a bit later on as it relates to council's emissions. Shoalhaven Council is well and truly aware of climate change. We have been in what people call the front line of climate change. So the Black Summer bushfires in 2019 and 20 burnt out 500,000 hectares of the Shoalhaven LGA. So that's twice the size of the ACT. You see the little map on the left-hand side is Shoalhaven Council's LGA, and 68% was burnt by that bushfire, the Currawong bushfire, over that time. Interestingly, the Australian government's emission reduction plan, 129 pages of it, does not include the word bushfire once. It includes the word sea level rise once, and the words global warming appear 6 times, but only because they're used in the titles of other reference reports. However, the word technology appears 264 times, or roughly twice per page. So again, setting targets and preparing plans is the easy bit. Implementing the actions is where the rubber hits the road. And I guess, as local government, we'll all move forward. Just a bit of an outline of my presentation today. We're going to talk a bit about our sustainable energy strategy and policies, the drivers of the work that we've done at Shoalhaven Council. Touch on some of our initiatives relating to the revolving energy fund, solar PV, LED lighting upgrades, street lighting and internal, external, electric vehicles, renewable power purchase agreements, which Sarah touched on earlier. And they're going to talk about some of our innovative projects that we've partnered with others to do or received grants to do, which hopefully give you a bit more inspiration in terms of your sustainable journey. Let's look at the drivers for us at Shoalhaven Council. So back in 2019, Council adopted a very simple sustainable energy policy. So that policy basically set out some objectives and targets to basically achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Throw yourself back a couple of years. Net zero by 2050 was also the New South Wales state government target a few years ago. That was considered by Gladys as being an aspirational target. So one that we hope to get to, but no promises, I guess, no concrete promises. Isn't that funny? Yet in 2 years now, the science is actually telling us that we probably need to actually achieve net zero by 2030 to 2035 to limit global warming. So now that aspirational target of net zero by 2050 has started to become a very real target and starting to get closer and closer to 2030. So at the moment, we are sitting with our net zero at 2050, but looking at possibly reviewing that in line with the science. So, we have to do our fair share, basically. What's really important, and you'll know that that was part of the discussion in the news with the federal government going to COP26, is that the interim targets are also really critical. 2015 is a long way away. It's very hard to work towards something that's almost another generation away. So those interim targets are really important. They keep us on track. They demonstrate that there is action taking place and that what we're doing will actually have some sort of effect. So our interim targets are to reduce emissions by 25% by 2025 and 50% by 2030. But again, looking at possibly tightening them all up in the next review of our policy, which will probably be early next year after the government elections. A couple of other targets that you see there. One is, the bottom left is looking at sourcing or generating more renewable energy. So moving towards renewable, transitioning to solar, wind, and other renewable sources. And we've lined those up to fit in with some of those interim targets as well, that also help towards the net zero emissions, because electricity is ultimately a big chunk of our greenhouse gas emissions. We'll talk a bit more in detail about that. Top right in the red box is we're striving towards energy efficiency. And again, I'll chat about energy efficiency obviously being one of the more important things to do before you start looking at actually offsetting and sourcing renewable energies to sort of run those assets that you have. We're looking at upgrading all our street lighting to energy savings LED by 2025, and I'll show you that we've made a start on that, and we've got some other opportunities to continue that. And the bottom right hand, the last target that I put in the policy was that we wanted to have some sort of influence on the Shoalhaven residents, the community. Much of this policy is about our corporate energy consumption and emissions. We really, as the level of government closest to the community, need to really model good practice and start including our work to sort of expand into those community emissions. But that's really challenging. If any of you have made a start in that. A simple one that we picked up in terms of a target was that we would try and help support and promote initiatives to increase the penetration of solar PV across dwellings in the Shoalhaven. So when this was written up in about 2018, 18% of dwellings in the Shoalhaven had solar PV. Without necessarily doing anything, to be honest, I'm probably being too honest in this webinar. I've told you a few home truths, but probably not something that we've really had a chance to do much of, particularly with COVID. And that's the solar, demystifying solar workshops and things that we had envisaged as part of our strategy. But the solar penetration across the Shoalhaven is now at 26%. So it's gone up from 18% in 2018-19 to 26% in 2021. Almost without doing anything, I think we're going to probably achieve this target, maybe in a canter even, the 33% of dwellings by 2025. So again, in setting that target, it might have been a little less than what was actually achievable, and Council will certainly strive towards looking at initiatives to help the community get over the line, particularly those that haven't already adopted solar. But at the moment, we're sitting at 1 in 4 dwellings with solar on the roof, which is not bad for a regional, rural, coastal environment. The right-hand side shows our sustainable energy strategy, which was developed after the policy. That covers all the initiatives that we will follow in a prioritised order from 2020 to 2025 to make a charge at our targets. I mentioned before about energy efficiency and how that sort of sits. If anybody works in sustainability, they probably would have heard of the waste hierarchy. The waste hierarchy is this sort of inverted pyramid where the top is waste avoidance and the little peak at the bottom is disposal. This sort of works in a similar way with achieving net zero emissions, is to work at the most obvious area first and then work down. So in terms of towards net zero, our sustainable energy strategy is set out in these themes, I guess. So energy efficiency, fuel switching. When I talk about fuel switching, I mean electrifying everything that's possible, probably work off gas, particularly bottled gas for our regional area because of the emissions that come with that and the challenge to offset that. The on-site renewables talks about the behind-the-meter solar PV that many councils by now have well and truly got into. And also the off-site renewables, which is where we need to actually source electricity through power purchase agreements. And ultimately, then we'd be looking at offsetting the rest. This graph here is in the strategy, and it sets out a waterfall graph that sort of is upside down. So we're basically going from the top at zero. We're trying to offset almost 80,000 tonnes a year of our corporate emissions from all the things that we do at council. So we I put across some of the rows there, the reduction targets by 2025 and by 2030, and ultimately the green line at the bottom is the 2050 target. You see some of the initiatives at the bottom that contribute to those waterfall cascades. So the first one, for instance, is LED street lighting upgrade. A reasonable little blob of brown that drops down there, a reasonable chunk of the emissions. And we move across into sort of LED upgrades of our facilities and our assets. The third one is energy efficiency measures, and again, a reasonable chunk there. A couple of things that I wanted to point out here is that most of those initiatives actually target electricity. They don't target other emissions such as our wastewater, our landfill gas and our fleet fuel, apart from those ones on the far right-hand side, where the second one from the left is electric vehicles. If 20% of our council fleet was electric, that's the contribution in terms of emissions reduction. You see the biggest brown streak there is actually through our renewable power purchase agreement with large sites and street lighting. So that's a big chunk. But the big green band is the most disturbing one, because that's effectively our offsets that sit with us today if we were to be net zero emissions by tomorrow. As in, they are the remaining emissions that we have no other solutions at the moment to avoid, and we would have to offset them with carbon offsets. And Vicky just mentioned a couple of the things around carbon offsets in terms of making sure that there's certified carbon offsets from groups like Climate Active. But in terms of the value and the cost to us, I'm not sure the price of the ones that Vicky was talking about, but in terms of following the Australian carbon credit unit price, in the last year, the spot price of Australian carbon credit units, which is equivalent to offsetting 1 tonne of CO2, doubled in price from about $18 an ACCU to now about $37 an ACCU. So our biggest concern is that big green bar there at the moment, based on the current spot market price for ACCUs, Australian carbon credit units, will cost us about $1.6 million a year to offset, which is a phenomenal price. Obviously, offsets can be sourced cheaper, but as Vicky said, you need to start chasing around to know whether they're the real deal or not. Are they certified, et cetera, et cetera. So the carbon offsetting side is quite probably a webinar in itself, but just highlighting that we really don't want to get to that point. We really want to try and reduce those emissions as much as possible. However, at this point in time, getting rid of some of those emissions regarding landfill gases, I'll talk about that we are doing some things on those things, but certainly wastewater emissions, direct methane and nitrous oxide emissions from our sewer and our sewage and our sludge is very challenging. If we look at Shoalhaven's energy load profile, you can see on the left-hand side that the two biggest chunks of that pie are made up of our water supply and wastewater processing. So we're a regional council on New South Wales South Coast that owns and operates water utilities. So we pump water out of the Shoalhaven River for water supply, massive amounts of energy required to do that. And we have, I think, about a dozen sewage treatment plants, so lots of processing. So this is just our electricity consumption alone. So half of that pie is because we're a water utility. So if you're a council that's not involved with water utilities, you might be in the Sydney Water area or a Hunter Water area and just have other assets. You'd be looking at the right-hand side of that pie where you might have a couple of aquatic centres, you have holiday havens, which are our tourist parks, street lighting, which obviously council pays for, and some of those civic buildings and community facilities. But for Shoalhaven Council, we actually consume about 36 gigawatt hours of electricity a year, which is quite a significant chunk. I know the Central Coast Council, I think the Central Coast use about 70 gigawatt hours, which is absolutely massive, double ours. But again, if you don't have those water utilities, your bill won't be as quite huge. But that's what sort of we'll try and deal with. I think one of the things that people tend to forget is that it's one thing to reduce your electricity consumption in today's world. It's another thing to accept that it's likely to continue to go up. Why? Because progress and development tends to be very energy intensive. This slide here shows you the Nowra sewage treatment plant. So on the left, only 3 years ago, we had a big plant, big trickle filters. On the right-hand side, we've got a brand new plant. And look, the plant is amazing. It's got UV filters and blowers for treatment of the sewage, air blowers, but it's hugely energy intensive. If we look at the energy consumption in kilowatt hours, and that graph is sort of overlaid, the left is basically when the trickle filters were in operation, and the right, we've tripled our electricity consumption at one plant. So again, it's one thing to reduce emissions from today's amounts. It's another thing to deal with them when we've got trending up, when we've got an upward trend of electricity consumption. So again, we've really got it ahead of us. So this is probably the crux of where we're at with greenhouse gas emissions, all on one slide. So that's Shoalhaven Council's greenhouse gas footprint or carbon footprint in that graph on the left. It's showing our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, associated scope 3 emissions for the financial year 2019-2020. It's showing a couple of big things. One is that obviously half of our corporate greenhouse gas emissions come from electricity, 48%. It's showing the big brown blob, brown for a good reason, because it's wastewater. And that's our direct scope 1 emissions from our sewage and sludge. The grey area is the landfill emissions, so those legacy emissions from our one tip at West Nowra. So again, that's been used for landfill for decades and continues to emit fugitive methane emissions, and not forgetting here that methane is has like a 28 times global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So those two, landfill and wastewater, because they're mainly methane, the volumes may not be as huge as some of the other parts of the pie, but because it's methane, it's hugely concentrated and results in quite a large carbon footprint. So the other parts of the pie is our transport and our gas. So our natural gas, which goes through to Nowra, but doesn't go any further south, and then our bottled gas. First thing with regard to this is that we need to make sure that we calculate it properly. So we use the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme calculators, which are accurate and repeatable and updated annually for emissions factors. So we make sure that we can actually calculate them properly. The graph on the right shows our trajectory to achieve net zero emissions. Some of the green dots, the first 3 green dots, are actual emissions results. The other ones are the targeted ones where we're heading. The only problem is, and this is my third truth for the day, which you'll probably think now I'm a real hypocrite, is that last year our emissions actually went up. So they'd been going down consistently for 2 years, and we thought, well, that was to do with all the good effort and the initiatives that we were putting in place. And just recently, I finished calculating the 2021 financial year greenhouse gas emissions, and that's that red dot, that target on the graph. And we actually had a 10% rise in emissions. I guess that tells me a few things. It tells me that you can't take your foot off the pedal because you're going to go backwards if you do. And also tells me that you're going to have years where you will have ups and downs. And I guess it's like the share market. Maybe look in the longer term at your trajectory rather than what's happening sort of year to year. Because that was a bit of a shock to me. When I looked into the data to see what really happened there, I noticed that our diesel fuel for our fleet vehicles doubled from 1 million litres to 2 million litres last year. And I can only imagine that's probably to do with all the work that's had to come after the bushfires with regard to travel and work and building bridges and all the things that came with that. We also did less gas flaring at the West Nowra landfill. I think the flare there might have been out of action for servicing or something for some time. So there's a bit more or less methane gas flaring. So you can see how it creeps up. Our actual electricity was not too different to the previous year. So again, those emissions and that jump was actually to do with some of the things that are a little bit more out of our control, I guess, with regard to the work that council did last year in terms of the recovery, particularly. One thing we have to consider here in this is achieving net zero emissions is some councils don't actually include these two emissions, so the wastewater and the landfill gas emissions. They don't include them as scope 1 emissions. They believe that it's their community emissions, I guess is a better word, that they're out of council's control. They're related to the increase in population and what people do outside of council's boundaries, probably what I'm trying to say. And again, this is where it comes down to what do you want to include in your net zero emissions calculations? Do you want to include these types of emissions that could be put down to being a community-related emission? I know what you're saying. Ultimately, all emissions count. It's just more what is in your control as a council. And if you want to hit a net zero emissions target, are there some things that you won't have control over that will be really challenging? And also remember talking about those offsets and the cost of the offsets. So just raising that with you anyway. The first things that we did with the energy efficiency was things like the simple low-hanging fruit, the LED lighting. So we got into LED lighting upgrades because they have a very short payback period. We did it at our indoor pools and our Nowra library. Some of the payback periods for these were around 2 years. So very, very quick. The libraries have very long operating hours, sometimes even on Saturdays and into the evenings. But again, this is, the action where we're starting to make the most of things like rebates, like ESCI's energy savings certificates, because they are ultimately, on a sliding scale to run out. We did those lighting programs projects using our revolving energy fund, which we set up a few years back. If no one has seen what a revolving energy fund or how it works, you follow those orange circles. Council seeded our revolving energy fund with $200,000. That fund then went ahead, has now funded 5 projects, 3 LED lighting and 2 solar projects. The savings from those projects, so that the annual savings on electricity that Nowra Library now make, they pay those savings back into the revolving energy fund. And after 2 years, they've paid back the capital cost of the lighting because they have a 2-year payback period. The revolving energy fund gets replenished and then we can put more projects on. So it's a sort of a cycle. We generally favour projects with a payback period less than 5 years because that way we actually can see the money coming back into the revolving energy fund. So things like decorative lighting and that have 10-year paybacks, they won't be eligible for the revolving energy fund. Just highlighting there's a really good tool that DPIE and 100% Renewables have put together, a free tool where you can actually set up your revolving energy fund in a financial spreadsheet there and track availability through time. LED street lighting upgrade. In 2021, we upgraded 32% of our street lights to LED. So they've gone from 50 and 80 watt mercury vapor lamps to 17 watt LEDs. That was quite a significant reduction in electricity. We're both saving electricity and emissions, Again, you see the results there, where the first 3 humps there are just the 3 previous years, middle of the years, where you got longer days for the lights to be on longer. And again, in the last year, that little curve's bumped down. That was just with a 32% upgrade in our lighting, but quite significant electricity savings. We're now faced with another proposal from Endeavour Energy to upgrade our street lighting, and anyone in the Endeavour Energy network online will be aware of this proposal as well. Slightly different arrangement where Endeavour will pay for the upgrade, and we will pay them back through what's called Tariff 3 or SLUIS charges, the street lighting use of service. We're also getting another look at a possible option of whether we could possibly capital fund our own street lighting upgrade. So we pay the capital, not Endeavour Energy. And that way we pay slightly different tariffs moving forward. So complicated field, but one to get onto, because the forecast market in electricity is showing that street lighting being off-peak, the prices will actually probably go up significantly because of the nature of the grid and the changes to the grid. Electric vehicles, again, this is something under fuel switching, where we're switching from petrol, diesel to battery-powered fully electric vehicles. So we bought 3 Hyundai Kona electric vehicles a few years ago now. We had them as pool cars, and also the mayor drove one, and we branded them with 100% electric to sort of help promote electric vehicles around the Shoalhaven. It's interesting. I love electric vehicles, and if you've ever driven one, then some of the zippiest cars you'll ever hop in, and incredible technology. When I chat to the fleet manager, and this is, I guess, what I'm encouraging people to do, is really consult more broadly. She has quite a different view of electric vehicles, as much as she also thought they were really good. But I'll just go through some of the barriers. The obvious barriers, which we all know about, the high purchase cost. I think this one costs something like $60,000 compared to maybe a base model of $40,000 to be fully electric. We obviously, there's a lack of fast charging infrastructure in our region. And if you're trying to look at reducing the emissions to zero, you really need to recharge with renewable energy. And that rarely happens unless it's plugged into an asset that has solar and it's during the day. The good part about that is in the future, the grid will become more and more renewable. So just normal charging will start to be renewable energy. A couple of the things that she's mentioned, though, was that they actually have an unknown resale market value, whereas something like a RAV4, she's pretty confident she would know what they would get for that. So that was a bit unknown, and that worried them a bit, but obviously they will maybe sell one of them and find out what sort of market value they have. Might cost 3 times, might get back 3 times as much after in COVID. I heard secondhand car market's gone through the roof. She said that there's a lack of EV models to suit the needs of council. So when you think of operationally, the sorts of cars that council need, most are small cars. The service warranty can't be done locally. They had to send them off to Campbelltown because they're electric and you need to be specially trained, is my understanding. A lot of talk about whether garbage trucks could be electric, but again, for our regional operations, there's some challenges there with range and recharging. One thing she did say was that the hybrids are well and truly here to stay. And in fact, we only offer hybrids in the small car leaseback. On-site renewables, we have 32 council-owned assets now that have solar PV. We've done about 15 in the last 2 years, so made a real challenge, a real go at it. The top right up here is actually only installed last week at our Nowra sewage treatment plant. So that's a 100 kilowatt ground-mounted system. If we add up the total 892 kilowatt potential of installed solar and look at what that would generate every year, we come up with about 1.3 million, or 1,300,000 kilowatt hours. In terms of council's electricity needs, that only touches about 4% of our needs. So I'm just being mindful that most councils will only ever knock off 10 to 20% of their electricity needs with behind the meter solar. So it's not going to get you out of the sort of the not going to get you too far, as much as it's really worthwhile. It's behind the meter, so you don't pay those network charges. Just be mindful that it has limitations in terms of the volume. A couple of tips on solar from the projects that I've done. Always use good quality panels. We're always chasing the 25-year product warranty on panels, and that's a product warranty, not a performance warranty. Good inverters and racking. So some of the inverters that we use, SMA inverters, Fronius are good inverters, and we also use M-phase micro inverters. Solar monitoring is essential for fault monitoring, so that will send you emails when there's a problem, and that's not uncommon. Even if someone's just turned the power off there or there's work being done at the asset, you'll know something's going on because the solar will go down, worth checking. If you've ever gone through and looked at your suitability of assets for solar and you've said, oh, some aren't suitable, go back and have another look, because even if they're shaded or they've got east-west roofs, they still have some solar suitability, and solar, the way it's priced, could still be worth pursuing. We've used the pre-vetted LGP 319 Energy Services vendor panel for our last large solar install. That can be very helpful. You don't need to do a full tender, and you can do an RFQ. And maintenance is really essential. Many people probably ignore maintenance and think solar is a bit of a set and forget, but we've just done some maintenance on our Ulladulla Leisure Centre. So the graph on the left shows the daily October 2020 yield of the 50 kilowatt solar on the roof of the Ulladulla Leisure Centre, and the maximum we got was around about 120 kilowatt hours a day. After a clean and then some of the fuses being fixed, you see the first round, the circled points, we've almost tripled the generation of the solar system there, because that's up around 300 kilowatt hours a day now. So really, really worthwhile. In fact, the cost of that had a 6-month payback alone just to clean and replace some of the damaged fuses, and to keep it all safe as well. Offsite renewables. Sorry, I'm racing and trying to cover a fair bit of content. I'm getting through it. Offsite renewable PPAs is when we need to look at other ways of slashing our emissions, and that's our electricity emissions there in the carbon footprint. So we can actually, with almost a single power purchase agreement for large sites and street lighting, knock off almost half of our emissions in a single bound. That's reference to the superheroes, by the way. The other thing we're doing with off-site renewables is we're supporting the industry. We're supporting those renewable energy zones of the New South Wales government. We're helping to transition towards a renewable energy future, which council can play a part in, being a big purchaser. Renewable power purchase agreements will help you achieve your sustainability targets. It will provide cost stability and likely cost savings, over that 7 to 10-year contract period. We're currently working with an energy market analyst to evaluate our business case and consider a request for tender for a renewable PPA. But I know many councils, I think I saw Deb Lenson in the participants from Eurobadella who have entered into a power purchase agreement that started in July this year. So again, a small council doing good things. So there are innovative projects that you might be interested in, and this is after the bushfire. So you see the top left photo there of single road in, single road out. That's only a gravel road, but we certainly do have single road in normal roads. That's the whole power infrastructure basically got burnt down, as did some of the telecommunications towers. So many people in these isolated villages in the Shoalhaven had no communication. So this project called Recovery into Resilience will cover off about 16 to 20 village halls and community halls throughout the Shoalhaven. We're putting 9.6 kilowatts of solar on the roof. We're putting in a 13.5 kilowatt hour Tesla Powerwall battery. And we're also installing out of that picture a generator connection point. So we've got 4 levels of electricity supply. We've got the grid, if that goes down. We've got the solar during the day. If that's overcast, we've got the Tesla battery. And then if we're really desperate, we've got a backup generator that can be plugged in. So those halls are now set up on an essential circuit that will run things like the lights, the satellite modem, the power outlets for people to charge their phones. There will also be a monitor in there that will have a direct display connection with the Nowra Emergency Operations Centre. So during any natural disaster, it will be able to broadcast emergency or evacuation messages through to what we call those local information hubs. A project that Council has been assisting Endeavour with is at Borley Point and Kyola, further down the coast. And Endeavour Energy have won some grants for this and have up around $6 million of funding. It's a project that they're looking to co-design with the community, which again has been very difficult with COVID. So it's really in the planning stages. But by the middle of next year, they're looking at already having a 3.7 megawatt hour community battery installed, which will actually take away the need for a diesel generator that is the backup power supply for this community. What's in it for Endeavour? Well, they may be able to avoid or at least delay the building of a new substation, which, you know, a cost of $10 to $20 million. They're really should be being a good pat on the back because they're looking at some alternatives here. Part of this is that possibly up to 100 residences will have solar and a battery installed, and that those batteries will be connected somehow through a microgrid setup to actually help run the rest of the community, you know, during times of need. But ultimately, if that electricity feed goes out to Kyola Borley Point, it will operate as an island and still be powered. So a really exciting project showing heaps of innovation all in one, you know, one area. So I keep an eye out for that one. We also have facilitated a solar farm that is ultimately built by Flow Power, an energy retailer at South Nowra. We gave our disused sanitary depot where the old septic tanks used to go, septic buckets and that used to go, pretty, you know, there's not much to do with that sort of land, like, you know, a landfill, a capped landfill might, but great for solar farms. You know, they had to do some landscaping works to level it, but ultimately they have now just opening up in 2 weeks' time, a 3 megawatt solar farm, and 20% of that power is actually already committed to Sydney City under their renewable power purchase agreement, and it's a 30-year commercial lease. Getting close, a couple more to go. One thing I wanted to add to here was that every 6 months we report to Council these pages or fact sheets on our sustainable energy projects called Energy Matters. Let's have a few photos, a bit of a summary, who's involved, and a progress update. And that really feedbacks to councillors or the work that's going on, to the directors. It's really important to continually do that so that you get this sort of communication going and understanding, and people are starting to see the results of the projects coming to fruition. The other thing I encourage people to do is apply for awards and recognition. We do that not necessarily to get a pat on the back, but it's a way of promoting the cause. People see that and they think, oh, that's really good, and they, you know, chase you up and follow you up. And again, it gets a head of steam and it can really help. And I think it's also really good to recognise individuals as well, because, you know, ultimately we aren't superheroes. We're officers working, you know, on a lot of different projects on a really good cause, and, you know, got to stop and smell the roses every now and then and provide some recognition to people. So my last slide is just some superhero moves that you might like to do. Obviously, to make that net zero plan and get it approved. Some of you may be well and truly past that. Some of you may still be talking about it. So that's really key. Get that, that's your driver. Seeking internal and external supporters, working as a team and networking with others. Again, you're not alone. There's heaps of network opportunities out there. If you're not a member of the Cities Power Partnership or the Business Renewables Council of Australia, get onto them. They're really helpful. Look for opportunities and make hay while the sun shines. So when I say that, tongue in cheek, go solar, but things like funding, the grants and the schemes. So, you know, we're doing a lot of solar now because those renewable energy certificates are on their way out, you know, on a sliding scale. So we're getting the most back as we can while they are literally available. Follow the energy pyramid, the hierarchy, you know, do things in a sort of logical order. Trial things first and then scale up if you're a bit uncertain or unsure how things will go. So we did that with solar, and you know, now we're doing 100 kilowatt ground mount. So we started with very small systems on some of our small buildings. Electric vehicles might be another way. Get them into the fleet, see how you go, make a start. Everyone needs to become, you know, au fait with it all. Monitor and measure success and then communicate it widely. Doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a really good way of keeping the effort going. And of course, recognise achievements and celebrate them when you can. And if all else fails, you can call for backup, call the Avengers.